Next up is Daniel Milne-Plückebaum, telling us on how to make sense of Virtualects. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Is that okay?
Maybe Control L. Just join us.
Okay, great. And, okay. Yes, thank you very much. Okay. Today I am going to talk about what I call Virtualects, and hopefully also on how to make sense of them. The Phrygian pun here is intended. This is a talk in the philosophy of language, and this is the outline. I first would like to describe a problem and raise some questions, and then I would like to propose a solution for this problem. So the problem is caused, or can be shown very well, by the augmented reality game Pokemon Go, which I guess all of you know in some form or other. We have here a screenshot of a Jigglypuff. Jigglypuff is going to be my example, so remember that Jigglypuff is pink and supposedly has a fluffy fur and is round and rather cute, sings its enemy to sleep, and so on. Of course, when playing Pokemon Go, there is no Jigglypuff in the actual world. This is how a situation might look like. This is the situation I want to focus on. We have two Pokemon Go players, Ash and Misty. And Ash says, "I see a Jigglypuff." Misty hears this and then kind of shifts her phone into the same direction and also has that Jigglypuff on her phone, let's assume. We also have two other people, Brock and May, and they just go past the scene and they don't play Pokemon Go at the moment. But Brock knows the game, while May has no idea what's going on. So this is the epistemic and imaginary situation. We have Ash, who utters the sentence, "I see a Jigglypuff." We have two people who know the game and take up what I would call an internal perspective towards it. We have one person who knows the game but presently takes up an external perspective towards it, and we have one who doesn't know the game and takes up no perspective towards it. Now the question I want to ask is, what is the content of Ash's utterance of this sentence 1, his utterance, "I see a Jigglypuff"? For Ash, for Misty, for Brock, and for May, do they all understand the same thing? Is the content the same for all of them, or does it differ in some case? And it might be worthwhile to take these different perspectives into account, which I shall do now. So let's first focus on the internal perspective. What happens while playing Pokemon Go, so to speak? I want to make an assumption, and the assumption is that in playing Pokemon Go, one engages in a kind of pretense or game of make-believe, maybe in a Waltonian sense, maybe not. I hope to be neutral on this. I want to say that MBPG, this symbol there, is supposed to be the game of make-believe as grounded by Pokemon Go. That's just an abbreviation. So we can say that within this game of make-believe, Ash utters our sentence 1, which, remember, was "I see a Jigglypuff." So we can first ask, well, what is the content of sentence 1 as uttered by Ash in this game of make-believe as grounded by Pokemon Go? I want to work with truth conditional semantics, where we say that specifying the content of a sentence S involves specifying a condition that S imposes on the world, such that S is true just in case the world plays along with this condition. This is a truth condition, and this truth condition involves laying out what the sentence demands of reality. And generally, if there are no special devices in play, this is supposed to be non-linguistic reality. So S, we can assume, is in truth conditional semantics supposed to say something about the things belonging to reality, and the constituents of S stand for these things that are in reality. So what is the truth condition of 1 as uttered in the game of make-believe? Well, we might say that 1 is true in this game of make-believe if and only if there's an object O such that Jigglypuff applies to O and Ash sees O in this game of make-believe. But so far, of course, this doesn't tell us what the non-linguistic world must be like, such that one is true, because we still have this Jigglypuff applies component, which is metalinguistic. So what we need is an application condition for Jigglypuff. When does the predicate Jigglypuff apply to something? So we might ask, what kind of predicate is Jigglypuff? Well, in the game, Pokemon are supposed to be biological species. So we can assume that Jigglypuff in the game of make-believe is the same kind of predicate as, for example, Tiger is outside of the game of make-believe. And Tiger, according to Putnam and Kripke, who have also proposed the orthodox semantics for natural kind terms, is of course a species predicate. So we can conclude in this game of make-believe, Jigglypuff is also supposed to be a species predicate. So now we have to answer, what are species predicates? How do they function? Well, as Kripke has shown, species predicates don't function descriptively. They function more like genuine proper names. And I want to follow Christian Nimz here, who kind of generalizes this notion and makes it a little bit more explicit in saying that species predicates are paradigm predicates, where a paradigm predicate has application conditions that are relationally determined, object-involving, and actuality-dependent, as grounded by what Nimz calls a value structure, where one ingredient is an equivalence relation of some kind, the second ingredient is a set of original samples of the species in question, and the third ingredient is just the actual world. So how does this work, for example, in the case of Tiger? Tiger has the value structure where the relation is belonging to the same species as. The set of original samples is supposed to include real flesh and blood and actual tigers. Those tigers that were originally named Tiger, supposedly. So yeah, we don't have the surface characteristics as part of the content of a predicate Tiger. We might use surface characteristics like having stripes and white belly underfur and looking like a cat and stuff. We might use that to identify tigers, but this is not part of the application condition. And Kripke, in Naming a Necessity, has of course given many reasons for why this is so. So a species predicate's denotation is fixed in virtue of each member's belonging to the same species as some actual original sample that was called whatever the species predicate is in question. So what about Jigglypuff then? Does Jigglypuff work the same way? Well, the relation might also be belonging to the same species as, but of course, there are no original flesh and blood actual Jigglypuffs that could ground the applicability of Jigglypuff. No Jigglypuff has been named Jigglypuff in the actual world. So it seems as if we regard Jigglypuff as a species predicate, it has a gappy application condition. The set of original samples is empty. There are no original samples. And given that it has a gappy application condition, Jigglypuff has no denotation. What I want to propose first is that in this reasoning something has gone a little bit wrong, for we might make a distinction between real species predicates and make-believe species predicates, where make-believe species predicates are make-believe involving. Remember that in species predicates value structure, the third ingredient was always the actual world. But if we change that to the game of make-believe or the world of make-believe or whatever, but something that is tied to the game of make-believe, then we might say that Jigglypuff has a make-believe value structure belonging to the same species as, some original samples, and the game of make-believe itself. So the application condition in the game of make-believe is grounded by make-believe original samples. So in the game of make-believe, one has a truth condition. We might construe games of make-believes as utterance contexts. It seems to me that in the original value structure for species predicates, the actual world serves as an utterance context. It is the context of utterance in which the original samples have been named tigers, for example. So if we do the same for make-believe species predicates, we would have to think of the game of make-believe as an utterance context, such that in this utterance context, original samples of Jigglypuffs have been called Jigglypuff, which ground the application condition of the term in question. And Kripke, in his John Locke lectures, Reference and Existence, has also played around with the notion of pretended expressions, but has ultimately argued that they are not all that useful. There is, however, a problem. I have just said that there are make-believe original samples, make-believe Jigglypuffs. But of course, in the tiger case, the real case, we have mind-independently existent and perceptually salient individuals in our utterance context, such that we can say, this is a tiger, pointing at a tiger, which then grounds the application condition. But this is not quite the right way of seeing things in the make-believe context, because the Jigglypuffs are not suddenly there. They don't appear out of thin air, so to speak. There are not non-existent objects that we can point to, that we need some means of specifying them, because we still have to imagine them. One can maybe regard the situation as differing from one in which an inhabitant of the Pokemon world would name a Jigglypuff. This person presumably is in the right epistemic position, but we, as players of the game, are not. However, as Pokemon Go players, we do have an epistemic advantage over Pokemon world inhabitants, so to speak, because we know that Pokemon Go is a fiction. In particular, even while playing Pokemon Go, we know how Jigglypuffs are described. We don't forget that suddenly just because we engage in the game. So we know what to imagine, and we know how the original samples, so to speak, must look like. And from there, we can then go on to formulate the adequate application condition. So what we basically do is we regard Jigglypuff as a species predicate, and we fix the denotation of, or we find the original samples by externally given descriptive denotation fixers. We notice descriptions, and while these descriptions are not the meaning of the term, they can function as denotation fixers. So back to our starting point, Ash can just say that he sees a Jigglypuff. Everything in the game of make-believe is available to him. And in doing that, I would like to say that he is speaking a Virtualect. In the Pokemon Go Virtualect, Jigglypuff is a species predicate, applying to whatever belongs to the same species as some original samples that have been dubbed Jigglypuff in the game of make-believe construed as an utterance context. But to reach these original samples, Ash exploits his knowledge of the fictionality of the game and treats external Jigglypuff descriptions as denotation fixers. So Jigglypuff within the game kind of metasemantically depends on the external descriptions given by the game. But what about ordinary language? Brock and May supposedly speak ordinary English. They don't speak, at least at the moment, the Virtualect. So let's look at the external perspective. In ordinary English, Jigglypuff does have a gappy application condition, determines a gappy content, and so indeed has the same semantic content outside of the Virtualect as, for example, I see a Squirtle. And I think that this is exactly right for May. For in taking 1, I see a Jigglypuff, and 3, I see a Squirtle, as involving real species predicates, May doesn't understand 1 and 3 properly, and thus shouldn't be able to distinguish 1 and 3 on semantic grounds. So May lacks linguistic competence, I would say. However, we also have Brock. Brock knows Pokemon Go, but at the moment he's not engaged in it. He's not playing it at the moment, so he also takes up an external perspective towards the game. And for Brock, what might work is the ellipsis account. The ellipsis account has, of course, been famously proposed by David Lewis, who says that fictional sentences are synonymous to sentences with a fiction operator attached to it. So outside of the Pokemon Go Virtualect, our sentence, I see a Jigglypuff, might be synonymous to, according to Pokemon Go, I see a Jigglypuff. This is quite a nice result, because then for Brock, a sentence like 4 and a sentence like 5 are fundamentally about different things. 4 is about the content of a fiction, while 5 is about a situation involving a tiger. And within the Virtualect, our original sentence 1 is about a situation involving a Jigglypuff. So using make-believe expressions outside of Virtualects presupposes one's taken up an external perspective towards what's known to be a fiction, and to talk about not the creatures themselves, but about the content of the fiction. Now what we need, of course, is still to specify how this fiction operator works. And I want to use a broadly Phrygian proposal, according to which the fiction operator acts as a meaning shifter. Jigglypuff, in the scope of a fiction operator, doesn't refer to its ordinary denotation, but to its content construed as a Phrygian sense. But then we, of course, need to ask what the sense of Jigglypuff is. So we need to make sense of Virtualects. We can extract senses from the Virtualects themselves. Because as a fiction, Pokemon Go doesn't develop a life of its own, but provides relatively clear-cut conditions of what it is to fall under the predicate Jigglypuff. And from within the game of make-believe, Pokemon Go players can access these conditions as denotation fixers, not as senses, but as denotation fixers in the Kripkean sense for the make-believe original samples of Jigglypuff, as I said in the second section. And importantly, this can be done without needing to know the whole Jigglypuff description. Usually people working with fiction operators end up with having to specify the whole Jigglypuff or the whole Harry Potter description in order to come up with a sense of a fictional name. So what we need is we need to look inside of the Virtualect, so to speak, and refer to what people are referring to within this language, within this game of make-believe. So we basically need a kind of deferring description, or we basically need to say that Jigglypuff, outside of the fiction, has the same sense as a deferring description of some kind. And this is the last thing I want to propose. This deferring description might be a deflector description in the sense of Markus Kracht, where a deflector description is built up as follows. A deflector is a device to borrow someone else's language in the language of, for example, in the language of a philosophy of computer game scholar, or in the language of the 1980s, or indeed in the language of a Pokemon Go player. So our sentence, I see a Jigglypuff, with the fiction operator attached to it, is synonymous to, in the language of a Pokemon Go player, I see a Jigglypuff. And the external sense of Jigglypuff is that of what, in the language of a Pokemon Go player, is a Jigglypuff. So it is, we kind of look from the outside into the Virtualect and then quote what people as Virtualect speakers say, but of course from this external position. So we now know what everybody says and what everybody understands. We have the content that Ash utters, we have what Misty understands, we have what Brock understands, and we have what May understands. May understands nothing in this situation. So I want to close with some properties that my account has, philosophy of language-wise. The proposal is expression transforming. Within the Virtualect, expressions are different than what they are outside of the Virtualect. They are species terms within the Virtualect, but deflector phrases outside of the Virtualect. It is aboutness shifting. If we speak from within the Virtualect, we speak about situations involving Jigglypuffs. When we speak from outside of the Virtualect, we speak about the content of a fiction. It is metalinguistic, but it doesn't involve the expression itself, but it quotes the semantics of the expression, so to speak. It is doubly parasitic. The meaning of the term within the virtualect depends on a metasemantic condition that is given from the external characteristic of Pokemon Go being a fiction, and the external perspective then depends on what within the virtualect is meant by the sentence. And it is monstrous. That is, the fiction operator is a monster in the sense of David Kaplan, where a monster is a two-dimensional context-shifting operator. Kaplan has, of course, wasn't a huge fan of these operators. That's why he called them monsters. But this is supposed to be a monster. And 6, it is quite complicated. But these accounts of fiction always tend to be complicated at some point, either on the semantic side, the pragmatic side, or the metaphysical side. So I believe it is not more complicated than other accounts on the market, and it deals with some intuitions quite nicely, in my opinion. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much for the talk. Questions, comments? Yeah, Mark?
Hi, very interesting paper, thank you. Okay, so here's what I was puzzled by. Suppose Brock turns to May, I think I'm remembering the names right, and Brock says to May, oh, they're playing Pokemon Go. It's a game you play with your cell phones. So at this point, May perhaps knows enough about cell phone use and enough about games that she nods and says yes. At that point, does her belief have the same content as Brock's, or is there a difference?
Well, given this picture, she would acquire linguistic competence that she didn't have before. She would learn the meanings of the names. She would then infer that Jigglypuff depends on how much Brock says, but she would come.
That's what's fussy about my example. He'll just stop there. He won't explain anything about the internal gameplay.
Well, she would still not understand what Jigglypuff is supposed to be, so she would still not have a content that she could gather from Ash uttering, "I see a Jigglypuff." But as soon as Brock explains that Jigglypuff within the game is supposed to denote a species, or so as soon as he gives a little bit more context, May would acquire some, she would come to understand the language.
So if he just stops there, this is what I think is maybe a complaint about the use of fiction operators. So I have the fiction operator in a vocabulary.
Yeah.
She'll understand the syntax if I see a Jigglypuff. That's not enough by itself to provide her with the same content as Brock. And what specifically is missing?
That Jigglypuff is a species predicate.
So it's the status of that predicate in the game that she needs to know.
Yeah.
Before she can have any content.
If they would see tigers, if that would be a game in which tigers were watched or whatever, then she would understand the sentence, because tiger, of course, has a meaning in the actual world. But Jigglypuff, she would need to know that it's a species predicate and how it works. It all hinges on the fact that this is a species predicate, because the other terms still have their actual semantics.
So it's a very high standard for comprehension is what concerns me. I can express to someone, say a child or someone who knows very little about biology, that something's a tiger without them having the metasemantic concept of a species predicate, can't I?
Well, but the child would still know how tiger or this point seems to me more directed at Kripke than at this. Is that right? I mean,
if you're reading Kripke as a standard of comprehension, then yes, I think so.
Okay.
So possessing the concept of species predicate itself is a precondition for understanding tiger, for all of it.
Yeah. She would need to know that Jigglypuff is a word like tiger.
That's helpful.
Okay, so that probably would be sufficient, I guess.